So, unless you've been hiding under a rock for the past half a year, you'll be aware that on the 11th of March 2020, the World Health Organization declared the COVID-19 outbreak a global pandemic. This meant that countries went into lockdown, travel restrictions were implemented, and a huge portion of the workforce had to begin remote working, whether they were prepared to or not. Since then, the world's been adjusting to a new normal way of working, and this includes new remote teams who are previously accustomed to working together in a shared office space. Some job roles can easily be carried out remotely. However, there are certain teams who rely on the ability to collaborate with their teammates on a daily basis. This is certainly the case for UX teams. As a UX designer myself, I know that collaboration is essential to the UX process. It supports idea generation and divergent thinking and provides a foundation for gaining critical feedback on designs. These UX teams are used to collaborating with a wide variety of physical tools, such as shared whiteboard space, conference rooms, projectors, sticky notes. Remote working is not a new concept. On the contrary, many successful companies are based entirely of remote workers. There are online tools available for remote teams to collaborate and best practices that remote workers should follow. So for my project, I want to carry out user research on a newly remote UX team to evaluate the effect of remote working on them and to answer my overall question: can online collaboration equal the effectiveness of traditional collaboration? I had 9 participants take part in my study. The participants were all from the same UX team and were all remote working due to COVID-19. Over the past 12 weeks, I've conducted a number of user tests and research, which includes initial online surveys, 3 focus groups, affinity mapping, research into online tools and remote working best practices, an online collaborative exercise for the full group, observations, unstructured interviews, research into successful remote-first companies, and I created a final deliverable, which I will discuss later in my presentation. So stage 1 was my initial online survey, and my key findings. Overall, there's very mixed feelings on remote working within the team. When asked how disruptive COVID-19 has been on their job, the average score was 3.22. However, there were outliers who answered this question with 7 and a 6. When asked, can you collaborate as effectively as you did in the office, 6 participants answered yes and only 3 answered no. Even more surprising for me was that the participants did not rate collaboration as a key challenge for them. And this was actually my first challenge I faced during the project. I worried about the value of my research project if the participants did not seem to have any troubles with collaborating remotely. However, analysing the data further, I discovered that there's a lot more user problems with remote working than collaboration alone. So this leads me to my key takeaways of the initial survey. Don't assume. As a UX designer myself, I assumed that collaboration would be the most challenging aspect of remote working for this team. I didn't take into account aspects such as homeschooling children, isolation, mental health, even the lack of physical space to actually do the work at home. And this bias led me to narrow my questioning at the very beginning of the project. But it also enabled me to be far more open to other ideas, and I made sure that I allowed the participants to direct the focus group in my next round of testing. And I'm so glad that I did this, as the focus groups and the affinity mapping ended up being the most valuable source of data for this entire project. I conducted 3 focus groups with 3 participants in each. Instead of focusing only on collaboration, I allowed the participants to share, debate, and bounce ideas off of one another regarding the advantages and difficulties with remote working as a whole. I ended up with 3 hours of focus group footage to analyse, and I decided the best way to gather my findings would be to conduct affinity mapping. So I listened through all of the footage, and when a participant mentioned key information, I wrote it down. Anything negative went on a pink sticky note, and positive went on a green sticky note. And as you can imagine, my wall was covered in sticky notes, so I began to group them into clusters, and these clusters soon provided me with specific themes and trends of remote working. And so the top 5 trends that emerged from the affinity mapping session were team dynamics and collaboration, home work-life balance, the availability of tools, health, and leadership expectations. And I'm going to go through each of these trends now. Team dynamics. Many of the participants mentioned that they do not collaborate as often as they once did in the office. They seem to miss the ease of asking members for advice or casual feedback on designs. Many of the participants said they don't communicate with their team often unless they're actually on the same project as them. Time was another issue for the participants. It was mentioned that collaboration takes a lot longer. There seems to be no easy way for sketches and wireframes to be shared with one another. And one member mentioned that they didn't realise how often they actually use their whiteboard in the office until they began remote working. Rapid prototyping, brain dumping of ideas, and gaining really quick feedback from colleagues is now a challenge. Video calls aren't common on this team, so some participants mentioned that they lack the body language, feedback, and facial expressions. However, some participants noted that video calls make them feel very awkward and would prefer not to turn on their web cameras. On a positive note, one participant mentioned that they feel like they can get a lot more work done at the home than in the office. And others mentioned that using MS Teams to stay in touch through messaging has been very helpful. Work-home life balance. The majority of the participants mentioned that they tend to work more hours now than they did in the office, and this is due to a number of factors. Some participants say that they don't realise the time. However, the majority of participants work longer hours as they're not taking their mandatory breaks properly. The participants say that they often eat their lunch or take their breaks at their desks without removing themselves from their workstation. A few participants also mentioned feeling anxious about being away from their desks during their breaks as they don't want to appear away online. As many of the participants work with external employees from different time zones, the participants mentioned that it's more difficult now to say no to meetings that are booked outside of their working hours. Many participants noted they find it difficult to disconnect from work, and this may be due to not taking their breaks properly or not even having a separate room in their house for their workstation. Parenting and homeschooling during lockdown has also been a challenge for some participants. Another challenge mentioned from some participants was that they get easily distracted while at home. But in contrast to this problem, one participant mentioned that the home distractions are nothing compared to distractions and noise in an office setting. Some participants also noted that they have a lot more free time in the evenings and that they're able to spend a lot more time with family, which is a huge positive. Availability of tools. Some participants mentioned that they don't have a proper workstation set up for remote working. Some of them are using kitchen tables and wooden chairs as home offices. It was noted that desks and chairs are very expensive, and during lockdown, they were sold out from many online retailers. Some participants have already spent a lot of money on office furniture, but others have said they don't want to spend their own money on office equipment if remote working was only going to be a temporary thing. Restrictions imposed by the organisation are also a challenge. Many of the participants have ideas and suggestions regarding which online tools could be helpful to them. However, the majority of these tools are not approved by the organisation and means that the employees cannot use them. Some members of the team would like to use their own drawing tablets to help with sharing sketches and wireframes with colleagues, but the tablets are not supported by company computers. One of the most successful and positive changes that occurred during remote working was a move to MS Teams. All of the participants mentioned that MS Teams had totally changed the way they work. They no longer rely on emails and phone dial-ins. One participant said that 90% of their communication and work can be done through MS Teams. Health. Many participants mentioned that the lack of social interaction has had a negative effect on their overall mental well-being. Remote working can be isolating for employees. However, it seems as though remote working during the COVID-19 lockdown has made this even more damaging. Some participants noted that because they are on a project on their own, they tend to work alone and miss communicating with the larger team. Some participants have been suffering from increased anxiety due to the uncertain times, isolation, and worrying about what others believe that they are doing while at home. A couple of the participants used to walk to the office every day, and it was mentioned that they missed their daily exercise. Despite this, many of the participants noted that they eat a lot healthier now. It was said that remote working wouldn't feel so isolating if we weren't under strict lockdown rules. Another participant mentioned that they actually feel calmer when remote working. Leadership expectations. Some of the participants feel as though they are lacking information to help with remote working, and that they believe that they have not been given the proper guidance on how to actually work remotely, what the best practices are, and what they should and shouldn't do while working from home. Another big factor is the lack of organisational information. The participants don't know where to get information regarding tax refunds for remote workers and if they will be compensated for buying office equipment or given an allowance towards internet or electricity costs. One participant mentioned that if they continue to remote work, they would be more than likely start looking for a higher paying remote job elsewhere. On a positive note, many of the participants mentioned that COVID-19 has made leadership more tolerant of remote working, and that they hope that when they return to the office, there will no longer be any issues with remote working. This was really the evolution stage of my project. I decided I couldn't just focus on collaboration when so many other user problems were brought to light. These findings helped my project to adapt, and I believe this evolution ultimately produced a more valuable insight into remote working for this team. I carried out the team collaborative exercise using Envision Freehand and MS Teams. Prior to this, I had done a lot of research into online tools for remote teams, but in the interest of time, this research can be found in my weekly blogs. The aim for this session was to try and replicate a collaborative experience that the participants would have carried out in the office. The feedback from the participants and my own observations from the session would help me answer my initial question of whether online collaboration can equal the effectiveness of traditional collaboration. The task for this team was to come up with ideas, sketches or wireframes of ways to design a dashboard which could contain up to 40 different data elements within 3 layers of progressive disclosure. And this was explained to the participants in an introductory presentation before the exercise began. So straight away, one of the key findings was that online collaboration takes a lot longer to organise and set up than collaboration in person. Meetings needed to be scheduled, the online whiteboard space needed prepped, there has to be at least 2 facilitators guiding the participants to the correct links, keeping track of time. There needs to be an initial requirements given to the participants, which may require slides to be designed. So time was definitely a challenge for online collaboration. Tech issues were also apparent. One participant wasn't even able to gain access to the Envision link and subsequently joined later in the exercise, and this was due to Envision not working properly on the Safari browser. Despite having been given a presentation of the requirements before the exercise began, many participants didn't seem to understand the ask of the exercise when they joined the Envision whiteboard space. The facilitators then had to go over the requirements again and answer questions from the participants before the sketching and ideation actually commenced. So this wasted a lot of time and increased the time needed to carry out the overall session. None of the participants asked questions during the introductory presentation, and because many were on mute and they had their web cameras turned off, there was no visual or verbal feedback for the presenter to gauge the comprehension of the participants. Even after the facilitator explained the ask of the exercise again, one participant didn't even contribute to the sketching of ideas at all, as they still did not believe that they understood what was being asked of them. This lack of communication extended throughout the ideation stage of the exercise. I observed that many participants remained quiet and worked on their own wireframes without verbally collaborating with one another. And this is a very different experience to the collaboration sessions that are held in the office. I also noted that some participants had trouble actually using Envision Freehand. Maneuvering around the whiteboard space and actually sketching ideas using a mouse or trackpad seemed difficult and time consuming. And overall, this resulted in fewer designs and ideas being generated. After the exercise was carried out, I sent a follow-up survey for all participants and conducted some unstructured interviews to support my own observations and gain more insight into how the team felt the online collaboration compared to face-to-face collaboration. 57% of the participants rated the online collaboration exercise somewhat less effective than face-to-face collaboration. And the reason for this included lacking in the human element, the time it takes to collaborate, missing simple sketching with pen and paper. Not understanding the ask of the exercise was mentioned by some of the participants, and some also had issues using Envision Freehand. A positive element mentioned was that it seems to be a lot fairer and equal, as the louder members of the team weren't able to take over the session. The overall feeling from the interviews was that the online session was not as effective as collaborating in the office, but the session was not a failure. Ideas were generated, and the participants could see ways that collaborating online could be improved. For my final deliverable of this research project, I wanted to create something meaningful, informative, and helpful for this UX team. And so I decided to create a recommendations guide for the leadership of this team. The document pinpoints the main areas for development that came out from the research on this UX team's experience with remote working. It concentrates on the outcomes from the focus groups and the trends that appeared from the affinity mapping session. The aim of the guide is to reveal the issues and areas for development that the leadership need to become aware of and offer advice and recommendations based on the research that I've done over the 12 weeks, suggestions from the participants themselves, and the case studies that I've put together on successful remote-first companies. I really hope the guide will be of use to the leadership team in helping this team move forward and enhance their experience of remote working. The guide is in PDF format and can be viewed in my submission folder. At the beginning of this project, I wanted to focus entirely on collaboration, as I believed that it was a key element in the workings of a UX team, and it certainly is. However, when it comes to remote working and remote working during a worldwide pandemic, collaboration is not the only problem for newly remote workers. I'm glad that my research project developed as it did. I was able to touch on a lot of other issues that remote workers face. However, I always had the clear intention of answering my initial question regarding whether online collaboration can be as effective as traditional collaboration. From my research into online tools and my case studies into how other successful remote-first companies are growing and collaborating, my answer to this question is yes. Companies all over the world are collaborating each and every day, and they have made this kind of work suit them. However, if I ask the same question only taking into account the UX team that participated in the research, I would have to answer no. Or perhaps more positively, not yet. I believe that this team are still finding their feet with remote working. The company itself has not begun a lifestyle change to remote working, even though the majority of its employees are now working from home. Comparing remote working to in-office working is not a fair comparison, as each has its own benefits and challenges, and this team is still working through those initial issues and problems. However, there is great potential for this team, and the outlook on the future of remote working within the team is bright and optimistic. I hope that my recommendations guide will be able to help management identify resolvable problems and enhance the employee experience of remote working. This project offered me the opportunity to develop my skills as a UX practitioner. As my background and expertise is in the area of visual design, I initially considered project topics focusing on UI design, branding, and prototyping. However, I wanted to challenge myself, and I decided to base my entire project on an area of UX that I don't have much experience with: user research. My only real experience of this element of UX was through the user experience module of my postgraduate degree, where I learned the importance of user personas, how to create empathy maps, and identify user problems. When I work on UX projects in my workplace, I'm continuously thinking about the solution, how it will look, and how it will feel. This project allowed me to bring all of the focus back to the users and allow them to influence where the final solution of the project would go. Testing myself and my abilities has been integral to the development of my skills as a UX designer. The outcome has not only been beneficial to my own career, but to all UX designers who now find themselves having to remote work due to the COVID-19 pandemic. My professional development and learnings over the past 12 weeks have made this a worthwhile experience, but the most rewarding element of this project has been able to give something back to the practice of UX. A phrase that I hear often these days is, "when we go back to normal." But it makes me wonder whether we will ever go back to normal, or if instead we will begin a new normal. The way that we work has changed, whether we return to the office or not. The way that we communicate and empathize with one another has developed and evolved over the past few months. We've been forced to remote work, and some of us for the first time, under strict lockdown conditions during a worldwide pandemic. COVID-19, as painful and as harrowing as it has been for many, has provided us with a unique opportunity to change the way we work forever